Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, you're very welcome to the Four Courts, the historic centre of the administration of justice in Ireland. We assemble for a lecture to be delivered by Professor Philippe Sands, Queen's Counsel, entitled East-West Street, Personal Stories of International Crime. This public lecture is part of a series of lectures which are being run by the Courts Centenary Commemoration Committee, and the committee's aim is to commemorate events which relate to the courts and to lawyers. The committee was established in 2013 when Ireland commenced a decade of centenaries, and the committee's members come from the Judiciary, the Court Service, the Department of Justice, the Office of Public Works, the Bar Council, the Law Society and Trinity College. The committee is organising this series of lectures and is doing so in an inclusive way. We hope that this endeavours will be of interest to you, to all of those who are interested in history. The events of the last 100 years have had a very decisive effect on the direction of this island and its people. And we have been remembering the 1913 lockout, World War I, the Rising. Professor Townsend brought us to the soldiers and law in the Irish Revolution. We had books, ballots, bullets, books and barricades, the exhibition we ran here in conjunction with the Council of the Bar of Ireland. We heard of barristers at law, the role of the Irish barristers in the military campaign in Gallipoli from David Nolan. We heard of the scrambling for the bones of the Patriot dead, how the events of 1916 have been commemorated over the last 100 years by Professor Dermot Ferreter. The Irish legal profession at the Battle of the Somme was told to us by Jerry McAlinden, David Nolan and Kieran O'Mara. This terrible calamitous fire, the destruction of our public records in 1922, was described by Dr. Katrina Crowe. And the Easter Rising, 1916, the trials, was told to us by Judge Sean Enright. Judge Enright gave us a very vivid description of the so-called trials in 1916. Tonight, we're going to hear of events leading up to different trials, the Nuremberg trials. Fundamental rights are at the core of our legal system. Indeed, Ireland was prescient in adopting the Articles on Fundamental Rights in our Constitution of 1937. However, tonight we take a step outside our legal system and look at the development of an aspect of fundamental rights in international law. We will hear of the development of an international criminal court and of the origins of genocide and crimes against humanity. This step back is not taken in a dry legal style. The history of the development of these important crimes is seen through the prism of Professor Sands' family. In a remarkable story, really a detective story, Professor Sands brings us back to a city of many names, reflecting waves of occupiers, Lemberg, a city which changed hands 8 times between 1914 and 1945. Professor Sands' grandfather was born in Lemberg in 1904 and were brought on a roller coaster ride through Central Europe during the first half of the 20th century, the World Wars and the effects on people, including his family. The extraordinary confluence of 2 lawyers in Lemberg, who subsequently went on to develop concepts of international law prepared for the Nuremberg trials. His story is gripping because of the characters he has raised from the dry pages of history and brought into the light. For example, Ms. Elsie Tilney, a name Professor Sands found, written in pencil on a small scrap of yellow paper, folded in half in his grandfather's papers. The trail he followed to find out who she was and what she did is extraordinary. I have no doubt he will enlighten you this evening. Professor Sands is a very regular visit to Dublin, and he tells me that his handsome tie is not bought for this occasion, but in fact is 24 years old and was bought by his grandfather for his wedding. Professor Sands is Professor of Laws and Director of the Centre of International Courts and Tribunals in the University of London. He's a member of the Bar of England and Wales. He's a member of the Irish Bar. In fact, he has represented Ireland in international cases. He's a Queen's Counsel. He's a founder member of Matrix Chambers. He has previously held academic positions in Cambridge, in King's College London, and in New York University School of Law. He's the author and editor of many legal publications, including Principles of International Environmental Law, the Manual of International Courts and Tribunals, Justice of Crimes Against Humanity, and From Nuremberg to the Hague. Tonight, Professor Sands will speak to us on East-West Street, Personal Stories of International Crime, and it gives me very great pleasure to welcome Professor Philippe Sands, Queen's Counsel, to speak to us.
Thank you very much, Chief Justice and Justices and members of the Bar and guests. It's incredibly nice to be back in Dublin and Ireland, a place that I feel incredibly at home, although remarkably it's the first time that I've been in this building, and I'm incredibly pleased to be here. A little after 3 o'clock on Friday, October the 1st, 1946, the last day of a trial that had lasted a full year at Nuremberg's Palace of Justice, Hans Frank stands in an elevator. A small wooden door slides open. He passes through and enters courtroom 600, which you can see on the screen. Sitting in the courtroom is Herschel Pat. He's waiting for that door to open and for Frank to emerge. 700 kilometers to the west, Raphael Lemkin lies on a bed in an American military hospital in Paris. He's being treated for hypertension and he's waiting on a radio for news of the judgment. They are 3 men in search of consolation. Each is a lover of music, and I've often wondered which piece they had in mind at that moment. Let's go back 4 years to July the 31st, 1942, to Lemberg, the capital of District Galicia, right in the heart of Europe. It's no longer Soviet Lviv or Polish Lvov. The city of lions has been controlled by Germany for a full year. At the main railway station, Hans Frank arrives by train to the sound of church bells and a military orchestra. He leaves the station in a large black automobile, passes through handsome streets decorated with the insignia of the Third Reich. In front of the Opera House, children wave flags, red, white, and black. Since October 1939, Frank has been the governor of occupied Poland, appointed by Adolf Hitler personally. It's a gift in return for the services rendered to the Nazis since the 1920s. He spends the day at party functions, and in the evening he inaugurates a new theatre, a sanctuary of art, he calls it, for he is a man of culture. Years later, after the war, his friend Richard Strauss, the composer, will tell Klaus Mann, writer, that Frank was a nice guy, a music lover, refined with a great sense of humor. In 1943, Strauss composed a short piece for this man, Hans Frank, in his honor. I have the lyrics, but the music has been lost, so to speak, so we just have to imagine Frank, slender and swank. Frank says, "We, the Germans, do not go to foreign lands with opium and similar measures like the English. We bring art and culture." And to Lemberg, he brings Beethoven and Fritz Weidlich, a little-known Austrian conductor. He wanted von Karajan or even Furtwängler, but neither was available. Frank personally chooses the repertoire, which is Beethoven's Leonora Overture and then the Ninth Symphony. The following morning, Frank attends a ceremony to mark the first anniversary of the incorporation of the District Galicia and Lemberg into the general government after the removal of the Soviets. The Gazeta Lwowska praises his elaborate speech. He announces the reintroduction of European rules of social order into the city. Later that day, he holds a series of private meetings to offer reassurance on Hitler's approach. Galicia and Lemberg, he says, are the primeval source of the Jewish problem, but now, under German control, that will be addressed. There's still a few of them around, but we're soon going to take care of that. And like a good courtroom lawyer, which is what he is, he pauses for effect. It's a moment of drama. I haven't seen any of that trash hanging around here today. What's going on? They tell me there were thousands and thousands of those flat-footed primitives in this city, but I haven't seen a single one since I arrived. Those are the actual words entered into his diary for that day. The audience applauds. Frank hasn't seen any Jews because they're in the ghetto, 10 minutes away, 100,000 of them. In November 1941, it's his office which prepared the map with the title Umsiedlung der Juden, Resettlement of the Jews. The ghetto is a direct consequence of Frank's decrees, as is the death penalty imposed for setting foot outside the ghetto. The report records that his words are followed by lively applause. Within days of Frank leaving Lemberg, on August the 16th, 1942, to be precise, Die große Aktion begins, the great action to empty the ghetto. A week later, Himmler comes to town. Such events will have consequences across time and distance. In August 1942, the ghetto in the city of Lemberg is emptied under Frank's authority. This is footage from another ghetto, the ghetto in Krakow. It was made on the personal orders of Hans Frank. It is a private film, and the footage is now in the possession of his son Nicholas, who has allowed me to show it this afternoon. It's a private film. You see street scenes and people milling around, barefoot children, white armbands. Eventually, as you will see, we come to a young girl. She has a beautiful smile, and she wears a red dress. That smile has stayed with me ever since the first time I saw it. One of the families in the ghetto that day, in Lemberg, is the family of a Cambridge University academic, Herschel Pat. His parents, his brother and sister, and many other family members are confined in Lemberg and nearby Żółkiew, a small town 25 kilometers to the north. During the First World War, Pat enrolls at nearby Lemberg Law Faculty when the city is in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. 3 years later, in 1918, when the city is 3 years later, in 1918, when the war is over, so is the empire. Over a bitter single month, in November, control of the city passes from the Austrians to the Western Ukrainians and then to the Poles. The city's name changes with each successive regime, and there is a great deal of bloodshed. Through a long winter, Pat is on the front lines protecting his parents. I managed to find a photograph of the barricade. You can see it on his snow-covered street. In 1919, Pat moves to Vienna. At the law faculty, he picks up interesting new ideas about the rights of individuals, and a seed is sown. He meets Rachel, a student of classical piano, who will record in her diary that on the first date she played one of the early Beethoven sonatas. Very lovely, but not too easy to execute. Hirsch and Rachel marry in 1923, and they move to London. Lauterpacht enrolls at the London School of Economics, and 5 years later, their only child is born, Ellie, a son. In 1937, Lauterpacht is elected to Professor of International Law at Cambridge University. The war begins in September 1939, and Polish Lwów becomes Soviet Lviv. In June 1941, the Germans take control of the city from the Soviets. And once more, it is Lemberg. By then, Herschel Lauterpacht is 45 years old. As Hans Frank visits the city of Lemberg, Lauterpacht is deeply worried about his family. He hasn't heard anything from them for 18 months. His sister, Deborah, has one child, a girl called Inka, who is born in Lemberg. 4 summers ago, I met Inka in Paris. We drank black tea, and she told me about August 1942 with a clear memory. The first to be taken was her grandfather, Aaron, Lauterpacht's father. 2 days later, Herschel's sister, my mother, was taken by the Germans. It was on the street. My mother was rushed by Ukrainians and German soldiers. I watched from a window of our home on an upper floor. I was alone. My father was working nearby. Someone went and told him that my mother had been taken. I understood what had happened. I saw everything looking out of the window. I was 12. I wasn't a child anymore. I stopped being a child in 1939, so I knew the dangers and all the rest. I saw my father running after my mother behind her on the street, and I understood it was over. She speaks to me without any emotion. She has spent a full lifetime dealing with that single moment, watching from a window. I was watching discreetly. I wasn't brave. If I had been brave, I would have run after my mother. I knew what was happening. I can still visualize the scene, my mother's dress and her high heels. And my father didn't think about me. And you know what? I rather liked that. For him, it was simply that they had taken his wife, the woman he loved so much. It was just about bringing her back. And then my father goes off to look for his love, and he's wearing a dark grey suit, and then he is taken, and I am alone. Inka survives a few weeks hiding in attics, sheltered by neighbours, and one day she knocks on the door of a Roman Catholic convent, and she is taken in and is hidden until the end of the war. She tells me that the only condition is that she must agree to be baptized, and she does agree. Lauterpacht knows nothing about any of this. He's very far away. He's an academic active at Cambridge University. By coincidence, on the very day that his father is taken, he starts work with the British and American governments on the war effort. He offers legal advice. He has come to know Robert Jackson, President Roosevelt's Attorney General, who will become a justice at the US Supreme Court. Lauterpacht and Jackson work together as Lauterpacht reimagines the role of law in the protection of individuals. In the summer of 1945, after the war in Europe ends, Lauterpacht publishes a new book with the title An International Bill of the Rights of Man. It includes ideas on the protection of the individual against actions of states under international law. States should no longer be able to kill and torture and then hide behind a principle of sovereignty. This is a revolutionary idea in 1945, this International Bill of Rights. With the end of the war, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin announced there will be a war crimes trial in Nuremberg and that Robert Jackson will be the chief prosecutor. The British hire Lauterpacht to join the prosecution team. In July 1945, Jackson travels to London to draft the charter of the Nuremberg Tribunal. The US, the British, the French, and the Soviets will disagree about the crimes which the tribunal will prosecute, and so Jackson turns to Lauterpacht for help. On July the 29th, 1945, Jackson is driven to Cambridge from London, where he has lunch with Lauterpacht and his wife Rachel. They sit in the garden of their home on Cranmer Road. Here you can see him in that garden. The grass is freshly cut. Someone notes that it offers a sweet, fresh smell and that a child keeps wandering in and out. Over tea, perhaps with a favourite Victoria sponge cake from the local baker, Fitzbilly's, the two men discuss a list of crimes. Lauterpacht offers a first suggestion. Why not insert headings into the statute to help public understanding? Jackson is positive, and so Lauterpacht offers a second suggestion. Another idea, this time on atrocities committed on a great scale against civilians. Why not, he says, why not refer to those atrocities as crimes against humanity? Use that term in the heading. Here you can see the words in Lauterpacht's own hand. The term will cover torture and murder and other persecutions, and it will introduce a totally new concept into law and international law. Jackson likes the idea and takes it with him back to London. Within a few days, crimes against humanity is introduced into the Nuremberg Charter. This is the first time it's ever been used in any legal instrument. Lauterpacht recognizes that it is an innovation, but it is an enlightened concept, one that affirms that those who break international law cannot shield themselves behind the concept of sovereignty. Pause here for a moment. While all this is going on, 4,000 miles away in the city of Durham, North Carolina, another former resident of the city of Lemberg, Lviv, is also thinking about these same matters, but in a totally different way. He was born 300 miles to the north of Lemberg on a farm near the hamlet of Azariska, which is now in Belarus. His name is Raphael Lemkin, and he also studied law at the law faculty at the University of Lviv. In fact, he arrived in 1921 and arrived just after Lauterpacht left. He earns, after 5 years, a doctorate in criminal law. The great love of his life is his mother Bella, who will sing him simple Russian poetic melodies, which he will always remember. From the world of university in Lemberg, Lemkin moves to Warsaw and becomes a public prosecutor. At a League of Nations meeting, he proposes a new international crime. This is 1933, to combat what he calls barbarism and vandalism against groups of people. Lemkin's focus is not on individuals like Lauterpacht, but on large numbers of people who are bonded by racial, religious, or national identity. Nothing comes of the idea, for rather obvious reasons, in 1933, but this concept will become his cause and his obsession. 6 years later, when the Third Reich invades Poland, Lemkin is in Warsaw. He escapes to his parents' town of Volkowisk, which by then is under Soviet control, and then he makes his way to Stockholm. The following year, in 1941, he is offered academic refuge at Duke University in North Carolina. The journey from Stockholm to America is long, 3/4 of the way around the world. He has little money and virtually no personal belongings, but he travels with a vast quantity of luggage, for he has spent his time in Stockholm collecting all the decrees promulgated by Frank and the other Nazis in occupied Europe. Lemkin's luggage is filled with paper, literally thousands and thousands of pages of decrees which he will cart across the world. When he arrives in the United States, he analyzes these decrees. He gets a book contract and he writes a research to see whether there is a master plan underlying the actions of Nazi Germany. The The book is published in November 1944. It is called Axis Rule. Chapter 9 of the book has as its title a totally new word: genocide. He has invented it. It's a new crime, the destruction of groups, and here you see it in Lemkin's own hand. In 1945, he's hired by the US War Department to assist in the prosecution of war crimes. He works with Jackson's team, but separately from Lauterpacht. He's greatly disappointed to learn that the Nuremberg Charter, with its list of crimes with which the German defendants will be charged, includes crimes against humanity but not genocide. So he flies to London to press for the inclusion of genocide in the indictment of the individual defendants. There is strong opposition from Jackson's office, under pressure from southern US senators who worry that claims of genocide will be used by African Americans. And the British too are against it because they worry that the crime of genocide will be invoked by victims of their colonial rule around the world. Many of Lemkin's colleagues think he's too pushy, but somehow, magically, the word does make it into the indictment. It's the first time it's ever been used in any legal instrument, and it comes with Lemkin's own definition: extermination of racial and religious groups. And it explicitly mentions Jews, Poles, Gypsies, and others. And it covers all the occupied territories, including Lemberg and Volkovisk. On October the 18th, 1945, the indictment is filed at the tribunal. I went to London and I succeeded in having inscribed the genocide charge against the Nazi war criminals in Nuremberg, Lemkin will later say. There is here a striking coincidence. The two men responsible for introducing the concepts of crimes against humanity and genocide into international law studied at the very same university. They walked the same streets, they entered the same buildings, they even had the same teachers at the law faculty. Yet each developed very different ideas on how the law might operate to protect against atrocity. The origins of both these new crimes may be traced to the city of Lemberg, to events at the end of the First World War, to the law faculty of the university. Indeed, you can even trace, as I have done, the origins to a single teacher the two men had in common: Professor Julius Makarewicz, a Polish professor of criminal law. I've even traced the origins to the building and to the very room in which Makarewicz taught. It's still a classroom. A quarter of a century after studying with Professor Makarewicz, the two men are now deeply involved in the Nuremberg Trial. Lauterpacht's with the British, urging the protection of individuals, and Lemkin's with the Americans, urging the protection of groups. They're together, but they are also apart, and they share the absence of information as to the fate of their own families, on which they know nothing. The trial will open on November the 20th, 1945. Amongst the 21 men in the dock is Hans Frank. Come back to the first part of our story. He was caught in May of that year, near his home in Bavaria, along with 42 volumes of his diaries and a fantastic collection of artwork. When I say fantastic, I mean fantastic. Amongst the many paintings is this one, Leonardo da Vinci's famous portrait of Cecilia Gallerani, the lady with an ermine, painted in 1489. It hung in Frank's private rooms at his headquarters in the Wawel Castle in Krakow, and he took it with him back to Germany when he left in January 1945. Frank's son Nicholas, who I have come to know, tells me that as a young boy, his father would make him stand in front of this painting and part his hair, just like Cecilia Gallerani. And now Frank is in the dock, charged with crimes against humanity and genocide. It's a very long way from the good old days hanging out with A.H. and Richard Strauss. Frank sits near Hermann Goering, his dark glasses concealing his expression. Lord Justice Geoffrey Lawrence, the English judge who presides over the trial, describes the moment as unique in the history of the world. Lemkin is confined to Washington because his colleagues find him uncontrollable and obsessive, pushing his genocide agenda. He's not a team player, and he's constantly talking to the press. But Lauterpacht is in court that day. He's with the British delegation, a team led by him which is strongly opposed to Lemkin's concept of genocide. Lauterpacht believes that genocide is impractical and it is not supported by any precedents. And he worries that by focusing on groups, they will be distracted from the greater task of protecting individuals. On the opening day of the trial, the prosecutors describe the crimes against humanity and the acts of genocide. And the atrocities in Lemberg are a focus following Frank's visit. Over 130,000 people killed, 8,000 children killed in just 2 months. At this moment, Lauterpacht listens, but he doesn't know whether the victims include his own family. Lauterpacht and Frank are in the same room on this day, and I'd like to see a photograph of that. But Lauterpacht's son, Ellie, tells me that none exists. I don't believe him. So I visit the archives of Getty Images, the largest collection of images from the trial, and I spend a full day going through hundreds of old glass plate images. And after several hours, I eventually find what it is that I'm looking for. A photograph taken the opening day of the trial. Lauterpacht is at the end of the British table in the top left-hand corner. His elbows are on the table, his hands are clenched under his chin. He's attentive. He sits almost directly behind a Soviet prosecutor at the lectern. Then if you move to the lower right-hand corner, you'll see the oversized famous figure of Hermann Goering in a light-colored suit. And then if you move 6 along, you'll see the semi-bowed head of Hans Frank. Lauterpacht and Frank divided by just a few tables and chairs. Lauterpacht at this moment knows nothing about the fate of his family. He will have studied Frank, but if Frank noticed Lauterpacht, he will not have known of their personal connection. 6 months into the trial, on April the 18th, 1946, Frank has his chance to set out his defense. The tribunal has just heard evidence from a lone survivor of the killings at Treblinka in Frank's territory. Samuel Reisman explains that he was present on the platform for the arrival and dispatch of Sigmund Freud's 3 elderly sisters on the 23rd of September, 1942. Later, I will visit Treblinka with my son. I'm curious to see what remains of the place. We later had lunch at a small restaurant in the nearby town of Brock, a placid and hushed place a world away from the killing fields described in court by Reisman. Brock is a simple place, and so is the restaurant. A radio plays an unlikely tune, and familiar words float around the room. The song catches my ear. There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. Frank is questioned in court about his role in Poland after 1939. I bear the responsibility, he says. This is totally unexpected. Do you feel guilty? That's a question for the tribunal. 5 months into the trial, however, he says he's been able to gain a full insight into the horrors. I am possessed by a deep sense of guilt. It feels like an admission of sorts, a rare thing. On the stand, Frank seems nervous. He looks around for signs of approval from other defendants, but it's not forthcoming. Did you loot art treasures? I saw to it that those art treasures remained in the country right until the very end. What about the art in your possession when you were captured? I was safeguarding it, but not for myself. You cannot steal a Mona Lisa. He's actually referring to Cecilia Gallerani, but the argument is hopeless. Goering is seen to be deadpan at the moment, but the other defendants are all grinning. Did you introduce Jewish ghettos? Yes. Did you introduce badges to mark the Jews? Yes. Did you introduce forced labour in the government general? Yes. Did you know about the conditions in Treblinka and Auschwitz and other camps? Auschwitz wasn't in the area of the government general, and I was never in Majdanek, nor Treblinka, nor Auschwitz. He hasn't answered the question he's been asked. He knows it's a dangerous question, and he's sidestepped it. Did you ever participate in the annihilation of the Jews? I say yes, and the reason why I say yes is because my conscience doesn't allow me to throw the responsibility just on the minor people. And he wants to be clear. Look, I myself have never installed an extermination camp for Jews or promoted the existence of such camps. But I recognize my own most horrible utterances. My own diary bears witness against me. And it's no more than my duty to answer your question in this connection with yes. And then he says this: 1,000 years will pass, and still this guilt of Germany will not have been erased. Great silence descends over the courtroom. Frank has accepted a collective guilt, the guilt of the group, but not his own individual responsibility. Goering is seen to shake his head in disgust. During the lunch hour, Frank talks with Captain Gustav Gilbert, the US Army psychologist who's tending to his needs. He hopes the judges were impressed by his sincerity, but just a few weeks later, when he returns to the stand in August, he retracts the tentative, limited expression of collective guilt. The other defendants have got to him. Von Ribbentrop, foreign minister of the Reich, has told Captain Gilbert that no German should ever say, ever, that his country is disgraced for 1,000 years. Admiral Dönitz, who will be Hitler's successor, complains that Frank should only have spoken as an individual for himself, not for the Germans as a group. In June 1946, Lauterpacht finally learns of the fate of his family. The news comes from Inka, his niece, who's now in a displaced persons camp in Austria. She tracked him down after hearing of a newspaper report that her uncle was involved in the famous trial. She sends an acquaintance to Nuremberg who will stand outside the Palace of Justice for 3 weeks, whispering, Herschel Pat, as people come and go. Eventually, someone recognizes the name. And this leads to a letter, and finally to contact. Inka tells her uncle she is the only member of the family to have survived. Later that year, Inka comes to live with Hirsch and Rachel in Cambridge. The prosecuting powers make their closing arguments at the end of July. This is an intensely difficult period for Lauterpacht. It's a time of personal grief and of professional challenge. He's preparing the closing arguments for the British. And at this moment, he writes frequently to his son, Ellie. One letter describes the moving strains of Johann Sebastian Bach's Matthew Passion. From this, he tells his son, I am able to draw some solace and some strength. The Matthew Passion must have had a particular resonance for Lauterpacht. The work reflects Bach's desire to emphasize a pietist belief in the individual. Every aria but one in the Matthew Passion is sung as ich, I. The three landmark choruses are sung in the first-person plural. That is intended to downplay the role of the priest celebrant and of the church and of the group. The connection with Lauterpacht's focus on the vital role of the individual is plain. Lemkin has to wait a bit longer to learn that his family in Volkowisk has suffered exactly the same fate. There's just one survivor, his brother Elias, with whom he's reunited in Munich. Elias Lemkin survived because he and his family happened to be on holiday in Moscow in June 1941 when Hitler invaded. Within days, Volkowisk was occupied. Lemkin's nephew Saul, who I find living in Montreal, totally impecunious but surrounded by books, has a very fine memory, and he tells me at length the story, what happened. And one detail haunts him as he recalls his uncle's visit to the hospital in Munich, where Saul was recovering from a minor operation. The Germans in the clinic were very nice to me, but my uncle wouldn't look at them. He hated them, like they were poison. As the trial draws to an end, the prosecution finally gets to its closing arguments. They address crimes against humanity in considerable detail, but genocide remains in the frame, somewhat surprisingly. The Soviets, the French, and by now even the British, all support a conviction for the crime of genocide. But Robert Jackson, on the other hand, who closes for the Americans, says nothing about genocide. British support is unexpected. Lauterpacht has been strongly opposed to the concept and makes no mention of it in the draft he prepares for Hartley Shawcross, the Attorney General who will deliver the British closing arguments. Lauterpacht's son Elie shows me a copy of the handwritten original manuscript, which argues for the protection of every individual human being and the rights of man against the barbarity of his own state, but which makes no mention of Hitler or even the Nazis. For Lauterpacht is implacably opposed to the reduction of matters to a struggle between groups. Elie tells me that his father never once talked to him, ever, about the fate of their family, that he was a private man, not prone to public displays of emotion. And this makes all the more striking a feature of Lauterpacht's draft. Over dozens and dozens of pages, the only defendant he mentions more than once is Hans Frank, the defendant most directly connected to the murder of his own family. Right at the end of the 76-page handwritten manuscript, Lauterpacht permits himself, finally, to become personal, to target the man who sat but a few feet from him in the dock. The handwritten version, which you can see on the screen, reflects a rare passion and anger. He writes of the accused, "Neither have they seriously attempted to alleviate the anger of the civilized world by a simple admission of guilt. Even the abject confessions with a ring of sincerity about them have been no more than artful evasions." He's referring to Frank, to the tentative expression of collective responsibility, offered in April, retracted in August. In his handwriting, he continues, "Witness defendant Frank, confessing to a sense of deepest guilt because of the terrible words he has uttered, as if it were his words that mattered and not the terrible deeds that accompanied them. What might have become a redeeming claim to a vestige of humanity reveals itself as a crafty device of desperate men. He, like the other defendants, have pleaded to the very end full ignorance of that vast, organised and most intricate ramification of the foulest crimes that ever sullied the record of a nation." On the legal arguments, Shawcross uses most of Lauterpacht's text, but he makes two significant changes. He adds British support for the concept of genocide, and he removes every one of the references to Hans Frank. By now, Lemkin too has learned of Frank's role in the destruction of his entire family. In a New York archive, I find this undated page of pencil writing in Lemkin's hand on a single sheet of lined yellow paper. As you can see, he's written out the word genocide about 25 times and then crossed them out. He's also toyed around with other formulations. If you look very closely, right in the middle of the page, hidden amongst the thicket of words, you'll see another one that is crossed out with a line pointing away that resembles an arrow. The word is Frank. Judgment is given over 2 days, on September the 30th and October the 1st, 1946. Frank is the 7th to learn of his fate. Has he done enough to save himself? Hoping for mercy, he too thinks about music, and he frequently, remarkably, evokes the work of Johann Sebastian Bach, and, in particular, the Matthew Passion. This we learn from the diary of Captain Gustav Gilbert, the American Army psychologist who's been helping him. It must be erbarme dich, mein Gott. Have mercy, my God. How extraordinary, I think, that two men on opposite sides of the courtroom, Lauter Pact and Frank, would find solace in the same musical space. As the judgment is read out, Frank sits motionless. The American judge Francis Biddle, formerly Attorney General, summarizes Frank's role from the day he joined the Nazis in 1927 to the end in early 1945 in Krakow. Frank destroyed Poland, crushed opposition. Concentration camps were introduced on his territory, notorious places like Treblinka, where Lemkin's parents perished, although Lemkin would never learn of this. Frank oversaw the liquidation of the Polish intelligentsia and thousands of Poles. He deported slave laborers to Germany. He persecuted Jews by forcing them into ghettos, starving them, and systematically and brutally exterminating them. Biddle takes note in his judgment of Frank's expression of terrible guilt for the atrocities committed on his territory, and he notes that not all the criminal policies originated with him. But if Frank's hopes rise, they are soon crushed. Frank was a willing and knowing participant in terror, exploitation, starvation, deportation of Poles, and a program involving the murder of at least 3 million Jews. Frank is found guilty of crimes against humanity and war crimes, but the judgment against him makes no mention of genocide. The tribunal adjourns for lunch without once mentioning the word. It has disappeared. The tribunal reconvenes at 10 to 3, but the defendants this time are not in the dock. Each will await his turn outside the courtroom. Each will enter alone to hear his sentence and then be escorted out. For many in the courtroom, the enduring memory of the entire trial is this single hour, the small sliding door at the back of the dock through which the defendants enter to face the judges. Open, shut, open, shut, open, shut. The door slides noiselessly. So writes Mr. R.W. Cooper of the London Times, who was formerly the newspaper's lawn tennis correspondent. Frank comes in at number 7. Up the elevator, through the sliding door, into the courtroom. He then loses all sense of direction and stands with his back to the judges. The guards have to spin him around. The writer Rebecca West, who's sitting in the press gallery and who happens to be having an affair with Judge Biddle, notices and writes about all of this. Odd proof, she will write, of Frank's complete perturbation. Frank listens to Lord Justice Lawrence, who is translated into just 4 words. Tote durch den Strang, death by hanging. Frank will never know that the French judge, his old acquaintance Henri Donnet de Vabre, whom he invited to speak at a conference in Berlin in the summer of 1935, voted for life imprisonment, but was overruled by the others. The French judge was said to be curiously tender towards Frank. Frank leaves through the sliding door. Open, shut, open, shut. When Captain Gilbert comes to his cell, Frank is able to smile politely, but cannot look at the military psychologist. Death by hanging, Frank says, softly. He nods his head. I deserved it, and I expected it. 2 weeks later, on October the 16th, Mr. Cooper of the Times is on assignment in Paris when he receives news of the hanging. The journalist will write in his book that he learned of the end in a little Paris restaurant as musicians strummed a popular new song written by Jean Sablon. It has the title Insensiblement. A photograph of Frank's hanged body is sprawled across the back pages of the newspaper. Ça, c'est beau à voir, a patron murmurs, idly turning the pages. A lovely thing to see. Frank is the 6th to be hanged in the courtyard of Nuremberg's Palace of Justice. Lauterpacht is satisfied with the judgment. He thinks it will contribute to the protection of individuals. But Lemkin is distraught. The judgment makes no reference to the word genocide, not even once, and he will later describe the day of the judgment as the blackest day of his life, worse even than when he heard about the deaths of his parents and family. So, what came next? Modern human rights and international criminal law came alive. The debate between the focus on the individual and the group never was resolved, and so both ideas were embraced. A month after the judgment, the UN General Assembly affirmed that the Nuremberg Charter, the judgment and crimes against humanity were now part of international law. And the Assembly went further than the tribunal, affirming positively that genocide is a crime under international law. In December 1948, states adopted the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide, driven by Lemkin, and the next day adopted the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, a non-binding instrument that drew inspiration from Lauterpacht's book. 2 years later, in 1950, the European Convention on Human Rights was signed, setting out a list of minimum rights for all individuals and setting up a European court to hold governments to account. Lauterpacht and Lemkin's legacies have been far-reaching. Yet, despite their common origins and their far-reaching influence, remarkably, it seems that the two men never actually met. Crimes against humanity and genocide, nevertheless, live side by side, and the ideas of these two men are the stuff of my daily working life, although more than 50 years had to pass before the ideas were really taken forward. The catalyst would be the crimes in Yugoslavia and Rwanda. In July 1998, more than 150 states adopted the Statute for International Criminal Court, which can rule on genocide and crimes against humanity. 2 months later, the Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda convicted Jean-Paul Akayesu, who oversaw the persecution and slaughter of Tutsis by Hutus for genocide. He became the first person ever to be convicted for the crime of genocide by an international court. In November 1998, the House of Lords in London ruled that Augusto Pinochet, former president of Chile, was not entitled to claim immunity before the English courts in relation to extradition. The acts in which he was alleged to have engaged, torture of his political adversaries, were a crime against humanity. This was the first ever such national ruling. In May 1999, Serbian President Slobodan Milosevic became the first serving head of state to to be indicted for crimes against humanity for acts in Kosovo. In October 2000, after he'd left office, genocide charges were added in respect of atrocities in Bosnia at Srebrenica. In March 2007, an American judge stripped a man now called John Kalimon of his American nationality. Why? Because in August 1942, he was a Ukrainian auxiliary policeman who rounded up Jews in Lemberg, and, said the judge, that was a crime against humanity. In September 2007, the International Court of Justice in The Hague ruled that Serbia had violated the obligation to prevent genocide at Srebrenica. This was the first time ever that a state had been condemned for violating any part of the Genocide Convention. In July 2010, President Omar al-Bashir of Sudan became the first serving head of state to be indicted for genocide by an international court. And in April 2012, Charles Taylor became the first head of state ever to be convicted for crimes against humanity by an international court. The cases go on, as we know, so do the crimes. What, one might ask, is the enduring legacy of these two legal terms? Lemberg Pact believed that we should concentrate on the protection of the individual, and I think he'd continue to argue that today. He believed that Lemkin's invention of genocide was in practical terms useless and that it was politically dangerous, that it would replace the tyranny of the states with the tyranny of the groups. And in a way, my own practical experience litigating cases concords with that view. I've observed for myself that by focusing on the protection of one group against another, there is a tendency to reinforce a sense of them and us, to amplify the power of group identity and association, which is both a source of sustenance and danger. How does this happen? In seeking to prove that a genocide has occurred, establishing the existence and expression of an intent to destroy a group in whole or in part, I've seen for myself how that process tends to reinforce both a sense of victimhood of the targeted group and hatred towards the perpetrators as a group. But of course, I also understand what Lemkin was trying to do, and he was surely right to recognize the reality that in most, if not all cases of mass atrocity, the actions are targeted not against individuals, but against those who happen to be a member of a hated group. And Lemkin would say, and it is a deeply powerful argument, that the law has to reflect that reality, that it must also recognize and give legitimacy to that feeling that all of us have of association with one or more groups. That profoundly strong sentiment was brought home to me very recently. I wrote an article for the Financial Times magazine, a profile of Dr. Jan Kisselhahn, a German doctor who's established a remarkable program to assist Yazidi women and girls who have been enslaved, tortured, and systematically raped by individuals associated with ISIS. He has arranged to bring 1,100 of them to Germany for medical and psychological treatment. In parentheses, not one has been allowed in to the United States or the United Kingdom. Kisselhahn identifies a connection between the possibility of justice and the future well-being of victims. For him, characterizing such atrocities as genocide is a vital first step. So he welcomed the use of the word by the European Parliament, by the Obama administration, and eventually, and in the face of strong opposition from the British government, the Westminster Parliament. Calling it a genocide, Dr. Kisselhahn told me, recognizes the group's identity, recognizes what is being done to it, and recognizes the group's right to exist as a group. In this way, for him, the implication is that crimes against humanity is just not enough. But I have to say, I'm concerned about the hierarchy that seems to have emerged, one that puts genocide atop the list of horrors, so that a mere crime against humanity or a war crime is somehow seen as a lesser evil. Call something a genocide and it will always be on page 1 of our newspapers. call it a crime against humanity. If it makes it into the papers, it will be on page 13. That is the power of the word invented by Raphael Lemkin. That is the power of our association with the need to protect groups. These issues are at the fore again today. Once again, as we know, a poison of xenophobia and nationalism and populism is coursing its way around some parts of Europe and the rest of the world, including the United States. I see this on my journeys to central and eastern parts of the European continent, to Hungary, to Poland, to the Ukraine. Those of you who saw my film, My Nazi Legacy, will have observed me in a faraway field, watching hundreds of people dressed in Waffen-SS uniforms, celebrating the creation of the Waffen-SS Galicia Division back in 1943. We see similar sentiments now in the United Kingdom, with the Brexit vote and in related political developments. One former London mayor, Ken Livingstone, rather offensively evokes Adolf Hitler as a supporter of Zionism. Another former London mayor, Boris Johnson, remarkably now Foreign Secretary, suggests that the European Union and Adolf Hitler somehow share common aims. And Johnson has no compunction in referring to the President of the United States of America, the former president, as part Kenyan to explain a perceived anti-British tendency. We see it too in the United States in the election of Donald Trump and the banning of certain people from entering the United States of America simply because they happen to come from a particular country. Who would have thought it possible? It is impossible for me not to have gone through the experience of writing East-West Street, an immersion in the world of the years between 1914 and 1945, and not feel an acute sense of anxiety as to what is stirring. Those who have read the book will know that I oscillate between the views of Lauterpacht and Lemkin, between the individual and the group, between the realism of Lemkin and the idealism of Lauterpacht. I can see the force of both arguments. I can recognize the tension and the struggle between the individual and the group, between crimes against humanity and genocide. It's not soon going to be resolved, which is why international law embraces both concepts. After I first told this story back in 2010, when I was invited to give a lecture at the law faculty at Lviv and made the surprising discovery the inventors of both concepts had come from the very same university that had invited me, but those who had invited me were unaware of that fact. A young woman approached me. She was a student at the law faculty. Why, she asked, do you take such a personal interest in these matters, which are so much a part of your working life? Lemberg, I tell her, happens to be the place where my grandfather was born in 1904, the grandfather who gave me 24 years ago on my wedding day this tie, which I wore on that day and on special occasions, which I consider this to be. In 1904, it was a very different place, I told her. I came to the city and accepted the invitation to give the lecture because I wanted to see the streets that he walked as a young boy when Lauterpacht and Lemkin were there. Along the way, in researching their stories, I learned more about his story, something which was not talked about in our home. He moved from Lemberg to Vienna in 1914 when he was 10 years old as the Russians occupied. He married in 1937. He had a child, my mother, in 1938, and he was then expelled from the Reich in January 1939. Curiously, I learned that my mother followed him to Paris 6 months later, but her mother, my grandmother, stayed behind. How on earth, I asked myself, did my mother, aged 1, get from Vienna to Paris? Who accompanied her? That's a story in the book, as the Chief Justice has mentioned. As a litigator, which is a sort of lesser amateur type of historian, you learn that every scrap of paper or photograph is capable of hiding information that won't be immediately accessible. It's the muck of evidence, which I, and I'm sure many people in this room, love. Look carefully, we learn. Keep an open mind. Attend to the unexpected. Find the dots. Try to join them. Nothing is ever quite what it seems. In my grandfather's papers, I found this small scrap. It's actually only about 1.5 inches by 1.5 inches. It was folded. One side was blank, and the other bore what you can see on the screen, a name and an address written firmly in pencil, in angular, strong writing. Miss E.M. Tilney, Manuka, Bluebell Road, Norwich, Angleterre. What's this? I said to my mum. No idea, she said. I didn't quite believe her. So I spent 4 years acting as a detective, trying to work out who on earth Miss Tilney was. Eventually, I met her. Photographically speaking, she was an evangelical Christian missionary from the Surrey Chapel in Norwich, and she made it her business from 1935 onwards to save people, all people, any people, from persecution. She never told anyone, even her own family, about what she had done. She was prompted to act as she did, I learned, by sermons given by her pastor, which offered a particular interpretation of a single line from Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 10, verse 1. It might be said that I exist and stand before you today because of Paul's letter to the Romans. I exist because of the courage of this remarkable individual at a time of real adversity. Many decades would pass before a more direct connection would crystallize between my family and the Lauterpacts. You see, Herschel's son Elie Lauterpact was my first teacher of international law. Only recently, 30 years after we had known each other, the man who gave me my first teaching job and who I was privileged to serve as a junior for and who passed away just 3 weeks ago, only 30 years after we had known each other, did Elie and I learn that his father Hirsch was born in Żółkiew on this street, Lemberger Straße. And then I learned that my grandfather's mother, Amalia Buchholz, was not only born in the same town, but on the very same street as Hirsch Lauterpact. This street, Lemberger Straße, was referred by the wonderful writer Joseph Roth as East-West Street, hence the title of the book. More time would pass before I would learn, having discovered that the first street on which my great-grandmother walked was the Lauterpact Street. Years would pass before I would learn her connection with the Lemkins. I learned that she travelled on the very same transport as the three sisters of Sigmund Freud from Theresienstadt to Treblinka on the 23rd of September 1942. And she too would have been observed by Samuel Reisman descending from the train onto the platform and heading off along Himmelfahrtstraße, the street to heaven, the short street that led from the rail platform to the gas chamber. That was the last street on which she walked. And 3 weeks after she walked it, Lemkin's parents, Bella and Joseph, would walk down the very same street and perish in the very same gas chamber. Lauterpact and Lemkin, individuals and groups, Żółkiew and Treblinka, personal stories really do matter, and individuals really can make a difference. I mentioned that I've come to know Hans Frank's son, Nicholas. He is a good friend now. When we first met 5 years ago, he took a photograph out of his jacket pocket and passed it to me. It was the lifeless body of his father, taken after he was hanged. Picture you have seen. It is, he explained to me, to remind me that he is truly dead. A couple of years after we came to know each other, Nicholas and I travelled together to Krakow in Poland, and we visited the Wawel Castle, where he had grown up as a small child. The director of the museum there allowed us to spend a few minutes on our own with Cecilia Ganarani. It was the first time in 70 years, since the summer of 1944, that Nicholas had been with the painting. And I was allowed by the museum director to take one image of that moment. After we were with the painting, we spent the day together, and at the end of the day, we went to have dinner together in Krakow's old town, a place well worth visiting. We talked about the book he was writing and the book I was writing. At the end of our meal, 3 people came up to our table, 2 younger people and an elegant, older, distinguished lady. "We couldn't help but overhear your conversation," the older lady said. "Your book sounds interesting." We invited them to join us and have some tea with us. And we talked for a little while. Turned out it was a mother with her daughter and her son-in-law. The mother was an academic, a professor of chemistry. She was very serene and, as I've said, very distinguished, and she now lived in Brazil. But she explained to us that she had come back to visit the city where she was born in 1930, and she had been forced out in 1939 because she was Jewish, 9 years old. I wondered how much of my conversation with Nicholas she had actually overheard. And she said, from what she said, it became apparent, not much. The daughter was born well after the war in Brazil. She took a very strong line, much stronger than her mother. She said, "I enjoy being in Krakow, but I'll never forget what the Germans have done. I don't ever want to talk to a German." Nicholas and I glanced towards each other. And then the mother looked at Nicholas and asked, "And you, are you a Jew from Israel?" Nicholas answered immediately, "No, madam, quite the opposite. I'm a German. I am actually the son of Hans Frank, the Governor-General of Poland." There was a fleeting moment of silence, and then Nicholas stood, and he rushed out of the restaurant. Later that evening, I found him again, sitting on the steps outside our hotel. And he said to me, "You know, they were right to have such strong feelings. I feel a great sense of shame for the wrong that the Germans have done to them, to the mother, but also to the family." And then, curiously, it falls to me to comfort him. Individuals and groups, it turns out, is never an easy thing. Thank you very much.